Coming up on the Men at the Movies podcast, I talk with Britt Mooney about Father Stu. His story has some dark moments, but being realistic about the darkness reveals how redemptive God really is. We discuss the meaning of suffering when we frequently ask God to figure out a way that doesn't hurt so much. But we discover that suffering is often God's tool to draw us to Him. We're not asking for an easy life, but praying for the strength to endure a difficult one. So let's discover God's truth in this movie.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being.
Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and joining me via the Zoom Riverside Studio internet web stream is my buddy Britt. Hey Britt, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good. We are diving into one of those great unknowns, which relatively unknowns. We're gonna tackle Father Stu today. And for those of you who are like, I have no idea what this movie is. This isn't like you missed Fathers 1. It's not Fathers 2. It's Father Stu, which when I was looking for asking people to say, hey, we're coming up on our second year anniversary, or coming up on our 100th episode, looking for some recommendations. Somebody recommended Father Stu, and I had never heard of this movie. I'm like, dude, I'm not doing this for one of our big celebration ones because I haven't heard of it. So we did some movies that definitely people have heard of. Then you brought up seeing this movie and about how much it meant to you. And so we put that on our list pretty quickly. And so we're going to dive into it. Just a warning. It was interesting when I watched it on Netflix that it says rated R. And it was basically like continual rough language.
Just say continual?
Something like that. It's like ongoing.
Pervasive.
Frequently flowing, something like that.
Wow, that's amazing.
So this is a side note. We didn't take notes on this. But if we hear something from one person, we're like, okay, that's interesting. Like I heard it from my friend Dave. And he's like, oh, you should do Father Stu. I'm like, all right, dude, whatever. Sorry, Dave.
Sorry, Dave. I don't know, Dave.
Sorry, Dave. But then when you're like, oh, man, we should do Father Stu, I was like, okay, there's a ringing here. I feel like there's some alignment. And it's that same thing with walking with God. Is like, okay, God, I feel like you're sort of doing something. And then somebody else says the same thing, sort of unprepped, unannounced, unwhatever.
Right.
And you're like, oh, I feel like we should do this. So, Britt, why Father Stu? Why this movie? Why are you so excited about this movie in particular?
It was recommended to me, not individually, but an author friend of mine, a Christian author, she put it out there on Facebook and said, great movie, loved it, warning, there's a good bit of language, but it's pretty awesome. And of course, that wasn't a warning to me. I was like, now I want to watch it.
That just piques my interest even more.
Now I want to watch it. But I am, as an author, when I write fiction, I have gotten to this place where when people read my stuff, they talk about this, how real the characters are, how flawed they are. And something that God has done, something he's done with me in my fiction writing, where he's just kind of told me, like, you can make the darkness as dark as you want, basically, but it has to be redemptive. And I didn't really put this together until I started doing it and realizing that being realistic about the darkness actually reveals how redemptive God is. It actually reveals it's not like just a minor adjustment from good to better. Like he takes crap and makes gold. Like he takes the worst and redeems it. And so I really appreciated this movie for that reason, that they weren't afraid to show the struggle, show the darkness, show the just how broken his life was there in the beginning and the first half. And mostly they were able to do that with cursing, in the sense of like there's no nudity, there's no sex scenes, there's no, I mean, it doesn't have a lot of other content that people would maybe be turned off with. It's mostly, probably even just mostly the F word. I mean, they get kind of free with it here and there, but all that to say is, I think that and as I read up on it, that was part of Mark Wahlberg's design. Like, he wanted to tell this story. It was very important to him, but he didn't want it to just be cheesy. And I think it reaches the right people that way, because I think we have a world that is living in that sort of brokenness. And when you're able to meet them there in a real, genuine way, as he does in the movie, and I think we'll talk about, I think it really matters to people. That's the kind of stuff that pulls people in and has the right conversations, So that's why I loved it. And I just thought it was an amazing story. There's, I'm not a Catholic, and I know some great Christians who are Catholics, so I don't have anything against it, but there, some of the things he says about God and about faith are just so powerful to me. And so it has that sort of darkness to great redemption to it. And I love movies like that.
Right. And it makes our job here easy. It's like, It's not hard to find God in this movie. It's not like Idiocracy or, it's not, we didn't have to stretch real hard. And so Dave, shout out to you. You were right. It is a really good movie, very powerful. And what we're going to dive into today is this idea of suffering and how it impacts us, because we've all been broken. We've all suffered, and how we respond to it is really important. And so I wanted to kick off our clips at the end of the movie. They actually have Father Stu, because this is sort of a biopic. It's not a documentary, but it's based on this dude's actual life, who did all these things. They did say that in real life, his dad isn't quite as much of a jerk as they show. He was actually a supportive and loving father, as opposed to the Mel Gibson's character Bill in this movie, who's kind of a giant douchebag. But it's about that contrast of how he suffered. And because this is a real story, I wanted to start with the real Stuart Long. What he says as he's nearing the end of his life is sort of the whole theme and thread of this movie.
It's a profound experience, suffering. And the struggles of this disease help me and help others to learn the way that we should have been living all along. It's taught me a little humility. It's taught me dignity, respect for others. And sometimes people like me, there's an extreme example. We need things like this to be able to make those changes and decisions in our life that are going to help us become better people, to become the people that God has created us to be when he sent us to this planet.
I love that. People like me. What he means is sort of hard-headed, doing it his own way, fighting for every bit. And so what I want to do is sort of probably break this up into two main sections where we talk about what do we do with our suffering. But first, this idea of his levels of suffering, how he suffered and the stuff that he had to go through. And then how God uses that, but also the response, because he talked in that bit about learning humility, learning dignity, coming closer to God. But that doesn't come naturally, right? That's a hard struggle. And that's what the movie does throughout, is shows this contrast, and the movie opens well, maybe not opens, but in one of the early scenes, we see him drinking over the grave of his dead brother. We find out later his brother died when he was 6. And he walks out, there's a statue of Jesus. And he's a boxer. We see him fighting. But he punches Jesus in the face. Granted, it's a statue, which hurts does some damage to his hand and ends up getting him arrested. But that was sort of a key scene that you brought up in our talk before this, Britt. So why is that scene so important in setting the stage for who Stu is?
And he's got some survivor's guilt going on. He definitely has some survivor's guilt going on where it should have been me. You were the good one.
Right.
I'm a piece of crap, like that sort of stuff. And then he's drinking. And part of this is the grief over not being able to fight anymore, because that was an identity. And here you have a man too, and we didn't even talk about this beforehand. And I think you see this pattern. He is looking for an identity. He's looking for some sort of identity. He looked for it in boxing, and then he's told by the doctor, yeah, you can box, but you'll probably die. This isn't good for you. And his mom is, begging him, just get a job, just get a regular job. And he keeps wanting to do something special.
He's very much Lloyd Dobler. I'm looking for my dare to be great situation.
He is looking for a dare to be great situation. And that's kind of why that first scene is important, because he's performing like he's going to be a rock star one day. Right. And then his dad knocks him down a peg.
Yeah.
And that's the story of his life. I mean, that's a show don't tell moment. Like, so that's the story of the rest of his life and so he has survivor's guilt. He's got that sort of like shame and like, I haven't made anything of myself, but I'm the one that survived, and he was the good kid and all that stuff. And then he strikes out at a statue of Jesus, and he talks to the statue, and he says, "Oh, you think I missed?" Because he threw the whiskey bottle first.
Yeah.
And I missed on purpose or whatever. and then he hits him, and then it hurts his hand, obviously. And the cops show up and arrest him, I guess, for being just drunk and disorderly, maybe. I don't know. He wasn't like, it wasn't clear why they.
I think he ends up being belligerent. And so he's like, we just were checking you out, and then you're kind of a dick. So.
Yeah. We often do this in our grief and in our anger and in our guilt, and we're dealing with all these negative emotions. We lash out at God, but it's not the real God, right? We're lashing out at something that's not even real. And even if it is the real God, and God can take it, but when we lash out at God, it really ends up hurting us. Like, blaming God for all the brokenness of the world never leads us to freedom. It never leads us to anything healthy. And it's very common for us to do this. Like, it happened with Job, right? I mean, like, I keep going back to, this is the first thing that was written down. Like, Job's like, you cursed me, God. Like, you won't even listen to me, and blah, 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 blah. If there were only a mediator between us, there's only some way. And of course, he does hear from God, and he's humbled by it, right?
It's like, my bad.
But all that to say, it's very natural for us to do this. We look for something to blame. There's got to be a reason. And I'll just throw this out there. Why does there have to be a reason? Like, if all we know is crap in this world and brokenness and stuff goes wrong, why does there have to be a reason? I don't know if anybody else has ever thought about that. Like, why do we ask even the question? If this is normal and every day, then why do we even think something else could be a possibility or should be a possibility?
I think it's like my approach with my son, who's in college. And recently he wrecked his car. He's fine, but his car is totaled. And, as one does who's parenting a 19-year-old who's in college, we don't talk very frequently. And, so I know he's struggling with his grades. He's doing stuff with the fraternity. And these are the snippets that I hear. And our brains, because I think our brains enjoy stories, and some of our brains, if you're like me, my brain fills in the gaps with the worst possible outcome. Right? He's spending too much time partying and drinking and playing with his friends and doing stuff with the fraternity and not buckling down, not studying, not doing the things he should. And I think when stuff happens, that's what we do. We're like, oh, we don't hear from God.
Yeah.
So we just sort of fill in the blanks with the worst. Oh, God must hate me. God must be angry. If I didn't, if I had lived a better life, if I hadn't been such a screw up, maybe this wouldn't have happened. It's that conversation they have later. All our lives, we say, eat your vegetables, you get dessert. We live in a very works mentality. And so our human minds, I don't think, grasp grace because it doesn't make sense. And by the way, Job never got his why. He never got the why. At least not in this side of heaven. It's not written down.
Nope. He didn't really.
And we're going to, I think, talk about the why scene from this movie on the YouTube channel, because that scene is such a visual scene. And Mark Wahlberg does a great job at his lowest moment. But that idea, like why, we look for the why, but what happens if you don't get it? Because for us, it makes us feel better because, it makes sense now. The disciples, for what reason is this man blind? Was it his sin or his parents' sin? Why? And for no other reason, right? Basically, it's like, it wasn't his parents' sin. It wasn't his sin, but so that God might be glorified.
Exactly. God allowed this because in the end, it would glorify him. But when we're getting back to this idea, like C.S. Lewis talks about, we want there to be this perfect world. We have everything else we have a desire for can be met in this world, right? But this desire for a perfect world, we have no evidence that it exists, and yet we long for it, and unless it does exist. And so we live in a broken world and yet long for an unbroken one. And we also have to realize that there's an enemy, a spiritual enemy, who gets involved in the mix, that when we go through these hard times, he's lying to us at the same time, and the world is lying to us, and our flesh is ready to hear the lie. We're like, that makes sense. And so there's all these forces that go against us. And yet at the same time, God is more powerful and more loving than all of it. And that's kind of what we see in this movie, but that's what we do. We lash out at God, and we all do it. I do it. Jesus did it to some degree, where he's in the garden and he's like, I don't want to do this. Come on, come on, God. Think of one other way that doesn't hurt this much.
Oh,
right?
You just, okay. Wait. Because I think you landed on the key piece. Figure out a way that doesn't hurt so much.
Yep.
That's our response. Why? If I know why, I can go through if I know I'm going to lose weight, I can do the diet. If I know I can do get stronger, I'll do the workout. If I know this will lead to a promotion, I'll put in the extra hours of work. Formula, do this, get this, go through the suffering, get stronger. But we don't know why we're in the suffering. And there's lines, there's a couple lines from a song that I've been listening to quite a bit over the last couple of weeks. It's called I Am Your Beloved by Jonathan David and Melissa Helzer. And it starts with, you were just mentioning the enemy, Britt, and the opening lyrics are, I've heard the accusation and I've heard the propaganda. I've heard the lies. They whisper to my soul that I have been forsaken and I'll always be forgotten. No matter what I do, it's not enough. And where do we go with those things of suffering? Basically, we twist it. We get angry. We can get angry at God. We can turn it on ourselves. It's like, oh, I'm going through this because I'm such a piece of shit.
Right.
Because I screwed up in the past, or because I'm just being punished for the life I lived. I did that a lot with my kids, of their behavior, the stuff they're going through is because of the sins of the father, because I got a divorce and, all that stuff.
Right.
Of the past. For what reason is this happening? For the sins of for the sins of the father. I'm a bad father, so I'm dealing with this with my son, with this with my daughter. And I'm just expecting this to happen with my youngest because that would sort of complete the set. The lies of the enemy.
Right.
They whisper to your soul, you'll never be enough. You'll always be forgotten. You'll always be forsaken. And that's what suffering tells you, if you listen.
Constant pain is very debilitating. Constant struggle, constant pain. We get tired very quickly, very easily, because we are so weak. And suffering shows us our weakness and reveals to us how weak we actually are, and just our base nature of it. And that's why God meets us there. Just to encourage people. Like, I know we feel, like you said, forgotten, and then we're getting lied to by the enemy and by the world, all of this stuff. And yet, time and time again in this story, in my life, and people's lives who have dealt with some of this stuff, like, God meets them there. It doesn't necessarily have to be a rock bottom moment, but God meets us in these broken places. Him going to church had nothing with going to church. Like, he didn't believe, he thought it was all a bunch of crap, right? He hits Jesus in the beginning and all of this stuff. And yet there's this, God still used this sort of selfish thing that he had to kind of draw him into this culture and into this world, where he could kind of start working on his thought processes and his beliefs. So, but anyway, so I love that part of it.
Yeah, you look at the guy in Acts. He showed up. He's just showing up because he's lame. He's looking for some change, looking for some money, looking for alms for the poor. And he gets saved. Basically, he goes in, he gets restored. Peter heals him. He goes into church, and revival breaks out back in the days of the early church. Like, he didn't show up. It's like, because I don't know. I try to make sure my motives are pure before I'm praying. It's like, do I really want this? Why do I want it? What do I want to do out of it? Is it selfish? How is this? I'm always constantly overthinking my motivation. And what's Stu's motivation? Because he saw this girl and he's like, you are a shining light that I can't help but basically I follow. I have to know you. I have to pursue you. Even though, as we'll see, it won't end in marriage. And interestingly, she ends up suffering because he ends up deciding to become a priest, and she thought they were going to get married. He's pursuing the girl. She said, I can't see anybody. I can't date anybody. We're not going to have sex before marriage. And he's like, I thought that's what confession was for. So you could do it and just go to confession. But she says, I can't, my parents won't let me date anybody who's not baptized. And he's like, sweet, I'll get baptized, and goes through the process. And he has another suffering moment. He goes out to a bar. He's still the same Stu. He's angry, pissed off at the world. He's a fighter. That's sort of one of his identities that he's grasped onto. So I'm going to play this scenario because he's just kind of just killing time at the bar, drinking heavily. And this stranger comes up, and it's this only time in the movie, but from some of the hints he drops, I'm pretty sure it's Jesus.
You're getting into the fine print on this way of living, pal.
What you think you know?
I know you got a long, weary road ahead. The headlights dim. Have to learn the hard way how to live in light.
You found someone else who wants to hear your shit?
No one wants to.
No shit. Take a hint.
In my experience, the toughest fights are the only ones worth walking into. You bring a tough guy to his knees. And the first few times he feels shame, rage, eventually relief.
You want to have a big dick contest, buddy?
I know how big your dick is, son.
I'd fuck you up more fucked up already.
Yeah. Someone beat you to it. Life's gonna give you a gut full of reasons to be angry, kid. You only need one to be grateful.
Wow. Well, that is the most fucked up ratio since the number of marshmallows and Lucky Charms.
You ain't owed nothing. But you're getting a chance. Don't go driving now.
The fuck was he drinking?
Water.
In the movie, they call him the barfly. But I mean, like you said, I think it's pretty obvious it's Jesus, because he is like, I'm going to F you up. Or he's like, someone already beat you to it.
Right.
You know,
He's like, I know exactly how big your dick is. I made you. Like that idea of, like, that's what that thing was. Like, he's like, yeah, I can take whatever you dish at me.
I can
Not going to bother me. I know you. I know your history. I know your future.
And it's going to be tough.
Yeah.
But he knew he made him a fighter. You know, you think you're tough, and the toughest fights are the only ones worth walking into. And that's just says so much about who God is. Like, he's looking for the most broken. He's looking for the situations where he can shed the most light, because it's the darkest. And I just love a lot of the things that he says there to him. But basically,
I think that one clip could be our podcast.
I know, right? He says, you know, life's going to give you a gut full of reasons to be angry, but you only need one to be grateful. And he's like, yeah, you're not even owed that thing. You're not owed that one reason to be grateful, but you're going to get a chance. You're going to get a chance, and to figure this out. And this is somewhat of a turning point in the movie, because he does drive, and he gets into a car accident, and he almost dies. And it is real, it's true to life that they thought he was going to die that night. I mean, he was like run over by a car, and it
looked horrific.
It was pretty bad. And his parents are resistant to faith, even though they care about him. And you can tell, like, his dad even kind of shows up and was like, oh, you're not dead, you know? But obviously cares about him. And so they're kind of showing us some of that. But this is a turning point because, and I love this part of the movie, that the turning point is an encounter with the supernatural. The turning point isn't he heard the right argument, or he was given the right ultimatum, or he was that wasn't the turning point.
He bucked up and picked up his bootstraps and worked real hard. And yeah.
The turning point was an encounter with the supernatural that he couldn't explain other than that was God. And there's a little scene with Mother Mary speaks to him, and he kind of tries to give her a hard time in his whatever little vision that he's having. But he lives instead of dies. And, reading up on the real story, that was part of the wake up call, was that he should have died. And yet he didn't, and he recovers. So it makes him really start thinking about his life and And there were some, like, I couldn't read anything about what actually happened, but Stu, the actual Stu, later says there were some supernatural moments that he couldn't explain. But I love that, because that really is the key. And that's what I pray for people, man. I mean, like, we can talk about whatever. We can use all the right language. We can use all the right terms. We can care, we can give, we can do everything. But until people encounter God for themselves, like it's not, the change isn't going to happen, because it's about transformation. It's not just about a better moral system. It's not just about showing up for church. It's not just about even, it's not about that stuff. Although that stuff can be real and genuine, but the core of it has to be that relationship, as much as we might overuse that word, but that encounter, that knowing, that hearing, that relationship with God, with you and him and me and him. And like, and then that's the difference. And I love that that's kind of the turning point in this movie, that's the difference. And he is somebody who is looking for that dare to be great situation. And because of that, I think even his chasing of Carmen was a dare to be great situation.
Oh, for sure.
Like it was almost unattainable. Oh, she's saying she has to wait till marriage. Oh, she's saying no. Like there's something in it that was like, I got to do more. And so if Carmen would have thought about it, he wasn't going to be, when he comes to faith, he's not going to be average faith, right? Which isn't really even a thing. Like if he was going to come to faith, it was going to be a full on.
He poured everything he was into everything he did.
He was going to pour everything into it. Like he was never going to be satisfied with community theater. Like he wanted to be an actor in movies. You know what I mean? Like he had that sort of drive to him. And so when he finally has this encounter with God, and I love the conversation with the priest where he kind of reluctantly in the movie, has sex with Carmen and he's feeling guilty about it. He's like, look, I know it's wrong. And the priest is like, well, that's good, actually, that you're developing this sense of what's right and wrong. And that's growth. Like, I love that sort of conversation. And he says, look, I'm being messed with here. Like God's like, I thought I was going to love this, but I can't, like, I'm feeling guilty about it. Like it was wrong. And the priest says another term for that is grace. And I love that line. And he goes, and so Stu goes, well, what do I do with this grace? And he goes, why don't you spread it? Why don't you spread his word? Talk to other people about it. And he's like, man, God's got the wrong guy. Like if he wants somebody to do that job, he's got the wrong guy. And the priest says, God doesn't make mistakes. And it kind of gives a little montage where he's praying and that's when he decides to become a priest. And I love the line he says at one point. He said, when he says, when he decides, I think I'm going to be a priest. He says, I can help. I don't know if you remember that line, but when he's talking with his mom or somebody about being a priest, he's like, look, I can help. Like it wasn't even about him anymore. And so that's why he could say no to Carmen. That's why he could act differently, because it was no longer about him being in front of people, winning boxing matches, being a star. It wasn't about conquering the woman. It wasn't even about him. It was about, I can help other people. Again, the core of that change is an encounter with God.
And this is all working towards this topic. What do we do with our suffering? It's very easy in today's glamorous, composed, fake Instagram world. Suffering. I don't talk about my suffering. I don't talk about my brokenness. Suffering's for pussies, right? I'm a real man. I don't suffer. I can handle my shit. But that's what had gotten him. That's what had gotten Stu to that point. Fighting all the time, in jail frequently. His identity was a pugilist with a criminal record, as the Monsignor said. But Britt, you and I know when God steps in, when the supernatural steps in, all that changes. But thinking back, that guy, was it for his sin or his parents' sin that he was born blind? Mary and Martha. When Jesus heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was a couple days. Because yes, God had the power. Jesus had the power he didn't have to show up to Bethany. He could have said, Lazarus, be healed. And Lazarus starts walking around. But he's like, our friend Lazarus is asleep so that you might know the glory of God, so that you might know the power of God. And if you don't think Mary and Martha were tough, those were the tough ones, right? That conversation, it's those toughest fights. The toughest ones are the ones that you can, at first they're angry, but then they're relieved. Because when you look at Mary and Martha, Jesus knew they were tough enough to hang on, even when it looked bleak, even when it looked dark. I know all things are possible. If you say so, right? That's the toughest. And what do we do with our suffering? We can fight it. We can hide it. We can deny it. It's like, it's not that big. Minimize it. It's not that big a deal. Yeah, that happened to me. Yeah, I lost my brother when he was 6. My dad was kind of rough, but it's fine, right? You can embrace it, be sort of this doormat forever. That's just who I am. I'm somebody who's broken and flawed, and none of those people are enjoyable to be around, right? What do we do with our suffering? What does Stu do with his suffering? And it takes him to this point. And he, like you said, has this clarity. I'm called to be a priest.
So now he sees his life in a different way. He sees all the things that have happened to him as an opportunity. Because it goes back to what the priest said. Tell people about God. Talk to people about God's word. And once he finally accepts that God didn't make a mistake, maybe God wants me to do this. Now changes his perspective. Like all these things that he thought disqualified him actually were part of the plan for him to be able to speak the truth. Because when he's fighting, quote unquote, to get into seminary, that Monsignor guy, whoever he is like, no one wants to hear the gospel from the mouth of a gangster. And Stu says, maybe that's exactly what they need. Maybe maybe that is what they need. Maybe they need to hear the gospel from the guy who used to kill Christians. Maybe they need that guy to say, I used to kill Christians, and then I got knocked off a horse. I had an encounter with the reality of who God is. And he didn't wipe me off the face of the earth, which I know I deserved.
Because the point is, if he can change me, he can change anybody.
He can change anybody. And at one point, Paul calls himself the chief of sinners. He didn't mean he was at the time the chief of sinners. Like, in other words, Paul wasn't writing to the Thessalonians or whoever it was. He wasn't writing to those guys saying, man, I go out and party and do all that. I'm sinning all the time now.
Seems like maybe Nero would have been up high on the list.
But he meant before, he's like, God can save anybody.
Yeah.
Sinners of whom I am the chief. I was the chief one. I was killing Christians. I was doing the worst stuff. And God is able. This is grace. That is the definition of grace, is that these things don't disqualify you. God is the one that qualifies. And we are so, my friend Sebastian Hawley uses this term all the time. Like we come up with this qualification mindset. So I got to be good enough. I got to be good enough. Like you kind of mentioned it earlier, when can I ever be good enough? That's a qualification mindset. God doesn't have that mindset. It's a relational mindset. It's about purpose. He's the one who empowers us. And if he calls, he's given us all we need to do what he's called us to do. And so it changes how he interacts. And do you have the quote of that sermon that he talks about, right?
Stu is in seminary, pursuing being a priest. And they actually ask him to sort of provide a little devotional tidbit, mini sermon. And he's looking at the crucified Jesus there hanging in the church and starts riffing a little bit.
Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. That's what Jesus said on the cross. As a kid, I saw a dude in a diaper getting worse than me with my daddy's belt when he was drunk. But I figured I could never screw up as bad as Jesus. Whatever he did to deserve that. And as a man, I thought, you know what? It serves him right. Trying to lie to the world to make us think we got to kiss his bloody feet for a pat on the head. Look, now, we've all been wrong, and we've all done some wrong. Some of us worse than others. With them words I said up top, Jesus asked his Father God to forgive the folks tacking him up. He ain't come to condemn the world, make us cower in shame for our sins. He came to forgive us. Think about it. We ask Jesus to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. God's forgiveness is contingent upon us forgiving others. That's the deal. It ain't easy to do. Truth is, we ain't got no power to do it ourselves. None of us, not a one. It's all God's grace. That's the man right there. You just gotta let him in. He'll do the heavy lifting.
I love that phrase. He'll do the heavy lifting. Because I can't forgive somebody on my own. I can't even want to forgive them. Right?
Right.
I can't do anything. And this idea, I was having a conversation with somebody, and he was basically saying, he's like, how am I doing? Am I getting better? Am I improving? And I said, look, dude, I know that you look ahead and you see where you want to be and you see where you are, and there's a giant gap, but you got to look back at where you were when you started this journey and see how far you've come from that dude. And it doesn't matter if it's, hey, I've only gone 2 inches, gone 2 feet, gone 2 miles. You've moved, and the grace that got you here is the grace to get you there. He'll do the heavy lifting because I can't. I can't want to. I certainly can't actually do it. I can't love my kids better. I can't be more compassionate and merciful. I can't have a greater sense of identity and self and who I am. But I can trust him. And unfortunately for us, it involves suffering. But as you've mentioned a couple of times, Britt, suffering helps clarify his identity. It's through suffering that he sees who he was created to be.
So when he gives that little sermon or thought or devotional thought or whatever it was at the church, like, again, this is a turning point for him, because he's talking about forgiveness. And again, how much all of this actually happened, but it's kind of there's an arc here from when he punches Jesus, the statue of Jesus, and now he has a different perspective.
He's pointing people to him.
And if you've ever been in a church, you probably knew the guy that was coming to church and he was getting in fights at the bar, and he was like, you probably knew who that guy was, right? Like, it's usually pretty obvious
church, yeah,
in a community that you're like, but to have this guy now standing up there and saying, we've all had wrong done to us. We've all done wrong. Some of us more than others. Like, he's being honest. He's being genuine. And he's like, look, but he didn't come to condemn this. He came to forgive. And what a powerful statement someone like the gangster can say. And then another part I love is when he goes to see his dad. it doesn't go well pretty much. And when he's leaving, he goes, "I'll pray for you, Bill. I'm praying for you, Bill." And Bill says, "Don't you dare. You're violating my rights as a man and an American." But of course, he's going to pray for him anyway.
Right.
And I've heard people say this too. Like I've had someone I know who's an atheist, and it comes up that someone else in their family was praying for someone in the neighborhood. They're like, without their permission. And I'm thinking like they were offended that we would pray for somebody.
How dare you pray someone well, wish them well. I was like, pray for them to be healed or for, how dare you? What a jerk.
How dare you do that? And I didn't mock it because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do exactly what you just did. I wanted to go, how dare you? And I think I did. I started to. I was like how dare you just pray for somebody and without their and I had to stop. But we have a culture that's increasingly more and more hostile to the truth of who God is. But the sad and ironic part is that they actually need who God is. That's actually who they need. And so it's not love to go along with it, to go along with those lies. Like I said before, let's just hit this. Let's just hit God. Let's just hit him. Come on, everybody. Let's just hit him. That's real freedom. But it's not. It's slavery and it's bondage. Like again, he ends up in jail. It's bondage. It's slavery. It's not going to lead us to the place that's going to satisfy us and give us that what we long for. And so he continues to use his situation and his suffering in order to talk to people like the prisoners. Anyway, so he continues to do that in the movie.
Well, I wanted to hit on that idea that the world is hostile to the truth, but hostile to the idea of suffering. Like, how could God allow this to happen? How can God, smarter, wiser theologians than us wrestle with these questions. So we're not going to even attempt to answer them. But there's a hostility to suffering. If you suffer, it must be bad, right? Because comfort is so high up there. It's like, oh, I suffered. I had to wait 4 days for my, Amazon package to arrive, but I paid for the overnight shipping. But blah, 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 woe is me. Or, it could be any one of the number of things. But this idea that it's not just, it's hostile to God, but it's hostile to suffering, which is frequently God's instrument to turn us to him. You look at, and that's what Stu says. We've said, he's got a clarity of identity. He knows who his true father is. He knows his purpose.
Yep.
Right. And it's all through suffering that you see in this movie. He's learned humility, and it's brought him closer to God. And especially the final sort of piece of the movie where he finds out he's sick. He's got this inclusion body myositis, which is something like ALS, something like Lou Gehrig's disease, where it's a progressive neurological deterioration. He doesn't have long to live. I don't know how much longer he lives for real afterwards, but and we've talked about this idea of suffering has clarified his identity. He's learned humility, right? Because he's allowing people to wash his face. He allowed his dad to help him later on. It's a humbling experience. But again, that's a choice. We have to choose what do we do with our suffering?
Right.
Because we can get pride. We can push people away. We could try to hide it. We could be embarrassed by it. And what this movie does a good job of is showing how to respond, because we don't always get the why. We don't know why. But the purpose is to draw us closer to God. As you mentioned on the YouTube channel, it's about wrestling with God. He wants us to wrestle. He wants us to be real. And suffering is a profound experience
Mm.
because as he's there, he's on the cusp of achieving. But you know what happens? What does? If this story was about a guy who chased down a girl, who became a priest, did a church for 40 years and died, we don't know his story. Nobody makes a movie about that. But they make a movie because it's a guy who stands up and is tough in the face of circumstances because he turned to God. Remember that his sermon on the forgiveness. How do you do it? He does the heavy lifting. He's like, I can't carry this. I need you to carry it. And it's so hard when we don't know why, when we feel, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? Why have you let this happen? I remember when I found out my daughter was pregnant about a month after she graduated high school. And I'm trying to go to him. I'm trying to listen to worship music as I'm driving to talk to her about this. And I was like, I can't right now. It's like, you and I are going to have words later. And it was that process fundamentally shifted who I was as a man and as a father and as a grandfather. Because I was like, I had to take who I thought I was and put that under it's like the pressure of the suffering weighs on you and shifts like coal into diamond, right? Because I realized what was false. I realized what I was holding on to that I shouldn't have been holding on to. And I realized my purpose with a lot more clarity. And it does take humility because guys all over the place, you need to do this. You need to do this. You need to do this. I'm like, and I'm thinking to myself, that's not where God is leading me. He's told me two things. I love her more than you do. And I'm using this to create the woman I'm using this to turn her into the woman I created her to be. And trusting God in that was one of the more difficult things I've ever done. And thankfully, I had men walking along with me to encourage me and to say, no, this is where you're heading. You want that baby to be a part of your family. And we just had him spend the night. And I took him to school today. And he loves his papa. And my grandson, has done so much healing for my heart. I would not trade a bit of it to not have him.
That's good stuff, man. I think that, as we see here towards the end of the movie, there's a lot of really redemptive moments. Through his suffering, there's reconciliation with his dad. There's reconciliation with his mom, and between his mom and his dad in the movie. There's these really tender moments, as much as the language still gets rough here and there, because that's probably just who they were.
Right.
And then there's this whole fight. Is he going to be able to do the job of being a priest? And he has to fight to get ordained. And then he finally does get ordained. And he's got this little speech towards the end where he says, my suffering is a gift from God. He actually sees his suffering, the same guy who was crying and why and all this stuff. He sees that the suffering, but what God did in the midst of that pain was a gift. He said, we shouldn't pray for an easy life, but for strength to endure a difficult one. Suffering is a chance to get closer to Christ and to show God's love, to show others God's love, to help other people, to help them find God's love. And then the dad gets baptized. There's all these really redemptive moments. And what we see in the end is that through his suffering, there's even reconciliation. And I don't know if this is based on a real person or not, but there's even kind of reconciliation with that other guy who was training to be a priest. He comes to him and he admits his jealousy and he admits all this stuff. And he's kind to this guy who was kind of a jerk to him, in the name of religion. He was kind of a jerk to him. And you see all these redemptive moments, but because he had been humbled and he learned that I'm not going to start praying for an easy life, but I'm going to just have to pray for strength to get through this one. And as the less he was able to do for himself, his dad had to do stuff for him. His mom had to do stuff for him. And there's a really interesting scene where like he falls off the toilet or whatever. And all of these things that are real to life. But those moments, you know, he didn't come to God so that he could get those things with his parents. Like he was fine. But God used all of these things, his pain and his suffering to have reconciliation. And we have to realize that too. Like sometimes God's allowing these things for a lot of different reasons, and we may not know all of them. But even in the midst of them, God can be redemptive, and he is redemptive if we will see the possibilities and the potential to bless others within it, and to be strong, and to just humble ourselves and admit that we can't do it, you know, whatever that might be. And so, yeah, so that's kind of where the movie kind of gets back to, where but he didn't get there. Like he had to, like it sounds almost cliche for us to end the podcast with that, right? Like, oh, don't pray for an easy life, you know, and yet he didn't get to that realization by having an easy life. Like he got through that realization.
That's what he says. He's like, you may think that I'm kind of full of crap, but I'm the one in a wheelchair. So maybe what I have to say has some weight. Right.
And it's the same way with Jesus, right? It talks about it in Hebrews, where it also talks about, you know, knowing the joy set before him, he endured the cross. In Hebrews, it also talks about, you know, suffering and wrestling with sin. And the writer says, you haven't sweat drops of blood yet. You know, you haven't gone as far as even Jesus did, trying to fight sin. And so there are these dark moments, and instead of using them as or allowing them to discourage us, it's so easy to do that, you know. And this is also where community comes in, and you see that in the movie. We won't go into it too much, but we see that he had a community around him who supported him. Even Carmen comes back around, and she's, you know, encourages him. And as that's where having a community is so important, to remind us of those things, to help us and to be the kind of the hands and feet when we need them to be. And again, this is a real story. I would really encourage people. Obviously, if you've gone this far in the podcast and you haven't watched the movie, you pretty much know. Spoiler alert.
You know what's going to happen.
But that's why I've encouraged people to watch it. You know, just because I think it's so redemptive, but also so real, and we need more stories like this.
We look at what Paul shares in his writings of his life after Christ, of shipwrecks and being left for dead and being stoned and whipped. And these are things that he chose. Like, I'm sure his life before being knocked off the horse was actually pretty good. He's, you know, high up on the ferry. He's living a good life. But I also know that he said, what I've suffered doesn't even touch what I'm expecting, and the glory of knowing Christ in me. That's what he said. It's because what is your suffering going to do? In the whole purpose of our suffering is to move us to God, because we can pray for an easy life, but it's not going to happen. And when it doesn't, what are you going to do with that disappointment? Because that's what suffering is the disappointment that we're living a difficult life. So yeah, check it out. Like Britt said, one of the reasons we like it is because it's real, and it shows a person whose life gets dramatically changed. And if that idea, if he can transform his life, he can transform anybody. So whatever you've got, we pray that it pushes you to Jesus, because he can do the heavy lifting.
Right.
So this has been Paul McDonald and Britt Mooney talking about Father Stu. And we hope that you enjoyed it, and hope you join us next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?